I'll never forget the way the room fell silent when he finally spoke. "We regret to inform you that your recent performance no longer aligns with our company's direction. Your employment is hereby terminated, effective immediately." I heard the words, each one crisp and deliberate, but my mind couldn't accept them not while I still had last week's cancer diagnosis folded in my jacket pocket. The medical report was still warm with ink, but now, another piece of paper colder, crueler, was slid across the conference table toward me. A pre-printed termination letter, dated days before I even entered this room. 12 faces turned toward me from around the long mahogany table. Most looked down. Some pretended to fiddle with their pens. Only one man held my gaze, John Cranston, the newly minted CEO of Arcturus Systems, with a thin smile that barely concealed the satisfaction behind his eyes. I had given over 2 decades to this company. I started in the basement as a level 3 technician, working 70-hour weeks through the dot-com bust, raising 2 kids while my wife battled pneumonia, surviving the 2008 crash that nearly destroyed us. I helped design the product line that saved the company and brought in federal recognition. And now, at 58 years old, after taking a few weeks off to begin treatment for pancreatic cancer, I was being thrown out like I'd never mattered at all. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked, "No review? No transitional support? Nothing for medical?" But Cranston, dressed in a tailored Manhattan suit, his face untouched by the burdens of real leadership, just motioned to the security guard behind the glass. "We've arranged someone to help you collect your things. The decision is final." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I stood quietly and picked up my coat. But what John Cranston didn't know, and couldn't have known, was that his decision today wasn't just a blow to a sick old man. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Because tomorrow, I wouldn't be the one leaving. He would. Looking back now, I suppose the writing had been on the wall for years. Etched in the subtle ways loyalty is dismissed in the name of progress, and how age becomes a quiet liability in boardrooms filled with buzzwords and polished smiles. I joined Arcturus Systems when it was still operating out of a converted storage facility in Pittsburgh, with a staff of 18 and a coffee machine that coughed more than it brewed. Back then, the company wasn't a brand, it was a mission. We were building defense software meant to protect the people who protected us, and every engineer, every technician, every late night spent sleeping on a cot beside the server rack meant something. It wasn't just code, it was conviction. I was 35 when I was hired, already older than most of the recruits they brought in straight from MIT and Stanford. What I lacked in pedigree, I made up for in grit. I worked nights, weekends, skipped Christmas dinners and anniversary trips. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I believed in what we were doing. And I believed that effort, real effort, still mattered. My wife used to leave hot meals outside my office door with little notes folded into the napkin. "Don't forget what really matters," she'd write. And I'd smile, eat half, then get back to debugging because there was always a client waiting and always a deadline looming. For over 2 decades, I wore every title they handed me. Systems analyst, lead architect, product head, director of advanced development. But the only title I ever cared about was reliable. I was the guy they called when servers went down in the middle of the night. The one who walked into broken meetings and found solutions without needing the credit. The one who stood by when younger managers came in and pitched ideas I'd prototyped 5 years earlier. Because I wasn't chasing the spotlight, I was chasing results. When the founder, Gordon Talbot, still ran the company, integrity wasn't just in the mission statement, it lived in how he treated people. He knew my daughter's name. He sat by my wife's hospital bed after her stroke. He handed me the keys to the company's most sensitive project without a second thought. Gordon saw me for who I was, a builder, a steward, not a title chaser. And when he passed away, I remember sitting beside his casket, promising myself I'd protect what he built. But the company changed after Gordon died. His protege, John Cranston, took over with a gleam in his eye and a briefcase full of buzzwords. Suddenly, metrics mattered more than morale. Stockholders mattered more than staff. Benefits shrank, contractors ballooned, and the people who'd carried this place through lean winters were gradually replaced by younger, shinier faces with little patience for legacy or nuance. I tried to adapt. I kept my head down, swallowed the snide remarks about outdated methods, and focused on the work. Even when I noticed that the interns I trained were getting promoted faster than I was, I told myself it didn't matter because my contribution spoke louder than any resume ever could. Then came the diagnosis. It was quiet, almost too simple, a few missed lunches, a fatigue that didn't go away, a test here, a biopsy there. The doctor looked me in the eye and said the words no one ever expects to hear. Pancreatic cancer, stage 2. I remember nodding, as if he just told me I needed a new pair of glasses. When I told HR at Arcturus, they were polite, not warm, not particularly sympathetic, just efficient. They said they'd review the medical leave protocol and asked me to forward my treatment schedule. There was no card, no phone call from the leadership team, not even an acknowledgement in the Monday morning meeting. I didn't expect fanfare, but I didn't expect silence either. Even then, I didn't let myself believe they were setting me up. I thought maybe they were just too busy, maybe it was awkwardness or discomfort. But when I returned after my third chemotherapy round to find my parking spot reassigned, my name quietly removed from 2 major project rosters, and a new strategic development lead. A 28-year-old with more Instagram followers than hours logged on, the floor moved into the corner office I helped wire in 9. The truth began to take shape. And yet, I still gave them the benefit of the doubt. I showed up, pale and aching, sat through meetings I'd once led, reviewed documents no one asked me to read, and tried to believe that my worth wasn't tied to my prognosis or my age. But deep down, I knew. Somewhere along the line, I had become invisible. Not because I failed, but because I had grown older, gotten sick, and refused to play the game of optics over impact. And they thought that meant I was done. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I had one final move left. One last ace. Left to me not by luck, but by a man who believed in loyalty, in legacy, and in people like me. Gordon Talbot hadn't just trusted me to build his vision, he had trusted me to protect it. And in that trust, hidden in the folds of an envelope I hadn't yet opened, lay the future of the company and of my redemption. That night, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than usual, like it had absorbed all the noise that should have been there, the laughter of family, the hum of purpose, the rhythm of a life not recently shattered. I had placed the cardboard box of my belongings on the kitchen counter, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. My badge, my nameplate, the service award from 2013, they sat there like artifacts from a life I was no longer allowed to live. As I sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, my eyes fell on a photograph that had been resting, half forgotten, on the side table. It was a picture of me and Gordon Talbot, taken over a decade ago, just after we'd closed a deal that saved Arcturus from a brutal acquisition attempt. We were both smiling with the quiet pride of a man who believed in building rather than buying, and me with the kind of respect that can't be taught, only earned. I picked up the frame and turned it over, remembering that Gordon's attorney, a measured and sharp man named Stephen Lang, had handed me a sealed envelope at Gordon's funeral nearly 5 years earlier. "Don't open this until your 60th birthday," Stephen had said, his voice grave, almost burdened. Gordon's instructions were clear, not a day sooner. Yesterday had been that day. I walked to my home office, my breath tight in my chest, and unlocked the small fireproof safe under the bottom drawer safe I hadn't opened in years. Inside, still sealed and pristine, was a navy envelope with my name written in Gordon's unmistakable hand. His cursive was as bold as ever, a steady line from a man who never wavered. I sat down, placed the envelope on the desk, and hesitated for a long moment, staring at it as though it might vanish if I blinked. Then I broke the seal. What I found inside was not just a letter, it was a blueprint, a strategy, and a message from a man who had anticipated betrayal long before it came to pass. The letter began simply, "My dear David," and what followed unraveled my entire understanding of the past 5 years. Gordon had created a silent trust, structured through multiple shell entities and blind investment channels, all of which pointed back to one ultimate beneficiary, me. Upon my 60th birthday, full ownership of 82% of Arcturus systems would transfer into my name, bypassing the board, the public registries, and even the company's own records. He had known what John Cranston was capable of. In fact, Gordon had suspected for years that John lacked the moral framework to lead, that his charisma masked a hunger, not for innovation, but for unchecked control. That's why, buried in the legal documents, Gordon had embedded what he called the fail-safe clause provision that, in the event of my unjust termination, granted me not just majority ownership, but executive authority without the need for board approval. It was, as he described it, a key forged for the day the locks turned against you. My hands trembled as I read line after line, the legal jargon blending into language I understood not through training, but through trust. This company is yours when the time is right. And when the wrong hands try to take what we built together, you will have the power and the obligation to take it back. I sat back in my chair, the weight of it all settling into my bones like cold steel. The man I had mourned had not only seen the storm coming, he had built a lighthouse for me to find my way through it. And now, despite the sickness in my body and the humiliation still fresh in my memory, I felt something flicker again inside me, not rage, not bitterness, but resolve. The next morning, I sat in Stephen Lang's office in elegant space, tucked above a historic bank in downtown Pittsburgh, where the mahogany walls felt like they'd witnessed every twist of fate in the last century. Stephen reviewed the documents carefully, his brow furrowed behind reading glasses, then looked up and nodded slowly. "It's all in order," he said, sliding a notarized form across the desk. "As of 8:00 a.m. today, you are the majority shareholder of Arcturus Systems. You have full executive rights, including immediate override of the board." I signed the papers with a pen that once belonged to Gordon Stephen, had kept it for this exact moment. There was no ceremony, no applause, just a steady scratch of ink on parchment and the sound of one man reclaiming what another had tried to erase. "Does Cranston know?" I asked quietly. "Not yet," Stephen replied. "The filing went public with the SEC 20 minutes ago. By the time he reads it, you'll already be through the front doors." I nodded, standing to leave, but paused as I reached for the folder. Did Gordon really think it would come to this? Stephen's expression darkened slightly, though his voice remained calm. He hoped it wouldn't, but he knew that legacy invites envy, and that some men would rather inherit power than earn it. As I stepped out into the morning light, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, something stronger than defiance and more potent than anger. I felt clarity, not just about what had to be done, but about why I had to do it. They had taken my position, my dignity, and tried to erase my presence like a stain on the corporate carpet. But they had underestimated something that people my age understand better than anyone else. Time doesn't diminish value, it reveals it. And now, it was time to reveal the truth. That night, I didn't sleep, not because of pain, though the dull ache from chemo still pulsed through my spine, but because for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I had a reason to stay awake. I wasn't just sick or unemployed or humiliated. I was, in fact, holding the key to a future no one saw coming. By morning, I had already mapped out the first steps in a spiral-bound notebook I had used during my final year under Gordon. Flipping through the old pages, I could see diagrams, product roadmaps, and handwritten quotes from Gordon like echoes from a past that now refused to die quietly. One quote stood out in red ink. "They'll try to erase what they can't control, so make sure they can't control you." Before the sun had fully risen, I contacted Stephen Lang, Gordon's former attorney, and within hours, the trust activation had been legally filed with the SEC. While John Cranston and his circle likely sipped lattes on the 23rd floor of Arcturus's glass tower, planning their next layoff round, I was already moving in the shadows, preparing to step back into the very building they had escorted me out of. But I knew reclaiming the company meant more than holding papers with my name on them. It meant knowing exactly what had been broken and who had done the breaking. So I began quietly, using my still active access credential zones they had forgotten to revoke in their rush to discard me. I logged into the system remotely and sifted through the company's internal networks, department files, and transaction logs. And what I uncovered wasn't just disappointing, it was infuriating. In the span of 3 years, Cranston had gutted the research and development division by nearly 70%, funneled over $900,000 into a consulting firm called Crane Advisory, which public records showed was registered to his brother-in-law's address in Delaware, and had reallocated funds from the employee wellness program to renovate the executive floor, including a private fitness suite and imported hardwood office panels. I found evidence of closed-door bonuses approved outside of board oversight, severance packages paid to top-level staff who were let go for challenging his decisions, and even internal HR complaints that had been marked resolved despite no formal investigation. Worse still, The retirement fund that Gordon had personally endowed for long-term employees had been quietly restructured, with nearly $3.5 million redirected to short-term strategic flexibility reserves, a vague label I later traced to a corporate jet leasing agreement. It wasn't incompetence. It was theft, systematic, deliberate, and cruel, and I wasn't going to let it stand. The next morning, I met with Elena Bryce, a former lead accountant who had abruptly resigned the year prior. She was nervous, meeting me in the corner of a quiet coffee shop downtown, looking over her shoulder like she still worked under Cranston's thumb. But when I told her what I had inherited and why I needed her help, she slid a flash drive across the table with trembling hands. "I kept this," she said softly. "Payroll, irregularities, phantom invoices, padded contracts. I thought about going to the SEC, but he made it clear I'd never work again if I did. I promised her she would work again, and not under someone like him." From there, piece by piece, I began gathering allies, not the loud ones or the ambitious ones, but the quiet cornerstones who had kept Arcturus alive when its leadership had abandoned its soul. Daniel Koenig, former head of engineering, pushed out after budget cuts. Miranda Shaw, product lead turned consultant, who had stayed long enough to finish what others started, only to be told her ideas were misaligned with current market ambitions. I found them all, one by one, and I told them the truth, not just about my return, but about Gordon's trust in them as much as in me. Each conversation added a brick to the foundation I would rebuild. But I also knew Cranston wouldn't sit idle once the news reached him, so I moved fast. I requested a formal copy of the shareholder registry and completed the final registration documents confirming the transfer of controlling interest to my name. At exactly 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the SEC published the update. By 6:13, I received the official confirmation. I was now the majority owner and executive authority of Arcturus Systems. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Cranston. "You're trespassing. Security's been notified. You'll be removed again." I didn't respond with anger. I didn't need to. I simply typed, "You might want to consult corporate counsel before sending threats. See you at noon." Then I walked through the front doors of the company that had tried to forget me, not as an ex-employee seeking closure, but as the man who had built its backbone and had returned to restore its purpose. As I moved through the lobby, familiar faces lifted their eyesome in shock, some in hope. A few even smiled, as if remembering something they hadn't felt in years. I walked past the portrait of Gordon in the main atrium and whispered, "You knew. You always knew. And now, so would everyone else." By the time the clock struck noon, the boardroom on the 24th floor of Arcturus Systems felt more like a courtroom than a place for quarterly projections. I had arrived 15 minutes early, not because I needed to prepare. Every step I took up to that point had been preparation, but because I wanted to walk through the halls as myself again, not as the ghost they dismissed, but as the man who still remembered what this company used to stand for. Whispers followed me like wind through tall grass, half shock, half curiosity as old colleagues caught sight of my face, still thinned by treatment, but steady, composed, alive with something far more potent than revenge. Purpose. I had sent one email, simple, undeniable. Emergency leadership meeting. Boardroom, 24A. Mandatory attendance. D. Whitmore. I had signed it not as a former director, not as a consultant or forgotten relic of a previous regime, but as David Whitmore, majority shareholder and acting CEO of Arcturus Systems. When I entered the room, the atmosphere cracked with tension. 8 board members sat in their leather chairs, arranged like a tribunal, though none of them truly knew who the defendant was anymore. John Cranston stood at the head of the table, his expression flickering between confusion and indignation as he paused mid-sentence. At his side stood Eli Price, one of the newer board members, shifting in his seat like he already regretted being there. "This is a closed session," Cranston snapped, his tone sharp, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it might steady him. I nodded to Stephen Lang, who entered right behind me with a thick binder under his arm and an expression as unreadable as marble. Then, calmly, I replied, "Not anymore." From the corner of the room, Marcus Levin, my so-called replacement, tried to blend into the background, but the blood draining from his face gave him away. He had it known. None of them had. Before Cranston could order security again, I raised a hand, not as a plea but as a command, and addressed the man at the door. "It's all right, Ben. I think you'll want to stay for this." Ben, a longtime security officer who had once walked me out, hesitated for half a second before nodding and stepping aside, the realization dawning that the balance of power had shifted. I moved toward the table with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who no longer had anything to prove. "As of this morning," I said, placing the binder down and opening it with a quiet snap, "I am the registered owner of 82% of Arcturus Systems voting shares. The SEC filings have been processed and confirmed." A silence fell over the room that was more than stunned, it was suffocating. Cranston's jaw clenched. "That's impossible. Those shares are held in blind trust established by Gordon Talbot himself," Stephen interrupted, sliding certified documents across the table, "all of which activated upon Mr. Whitmore's 60th birthday. That was yesterday." "You can't just," Cranston started, but I cut him off with a calmness he didn't expect. "You fired me without cause. You humiliated me. You used my illness to push me out so you could secure your hand-picked successor and sweep the company's decay under the rug. But in doing so, John, you triggered the fail-safe clause in Gordon's trust, which grants me immediate and unilateral executive authority." I turned to the others, making eye contact with each one as I spoke. "And now, I'm using that authority to call for an emergency vote to remove John Cranston as Chief Executive Officer of Arcturus Systems, effective immediately." The room didn't explode, it imploded. Some stared at their hands, others at the documents Stephen had passed around. Only one board member, Elaine Monroe, had the courage to speak. "This violates protocol. We have procedures." "With 82% ownership," Stephen interjected smoothly, "Mr. Whitmore is the procedure. He has legal standing to enact this transition without further vote. And if any of you are wondering whether this is personal," I said, leaning in just slightly, "let me be clear. It is not. This is professional. This is structural. And this is overdue." Cranston's face had gone pale, his confidence unraveling with every second. "You're making a mistake. I built this company into what it is today." "No, John," I said evenly. "You hollowed it out. You cut corners. You bled the people dry. You sold out the soul of this place for your own advancement. And today, we're done pretending that was leadership. A vote wasn't needed. But I raised my hand anyway, more as symbolism than protocol." One by one, hands joined mine. Martin Huang, the last remaining board member loyal to Gordon's legacy, followed by two others. The others remained still, but it didn't matter. The weight of my shares crushed any opposition. "It's over, John." He stood there, stunned, his mouth moving, but no words coming. When Security Ben stepped forward again, John didn't resist. He just glared at me as he picked up his briefcase. The illusion of control finally shattered. As he passed, he muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this. I have friends, people who matter." I didn't flinch. So did Gordon. And unlike you, he earned them. The door closed behind him with a dull finality, and for the first time in years, the room exhaled. I looked around the table, the very one where I had once been humiliated, and let the silence settle before I spoke again. This isn't just about removing one man. This is about repairing what's been broken. And I don't plan to do it alone. We start rebuilding today, with integrity, with transparency, and with the people who never stopped believing in what this place could be. There were no cheers, no backslaps, just a slow, collective nod from men and women who realized the storm had passed and something better might finally take its place. Justice hadn't just arrived. It had walked through the front door, signed the forms, and sat at the head of the table. The days that followed were not triumphant in the way movies would suggest. There were no standing ovations, no dramatic slow claps in the hallway, and no instant transformation overnight. Instead, there was work slow, deliberate, human work, the kind that builds things that last. And I was there for every minute of it, not as a returning hero, but as a man finally given the chance to set things right. On my second morning back in the CEO's office, I stood at the same window John Cranston used to gaze out of, not looking at the skyline, but at the people arriving below employees bundled in coats and clutching coffee cups, their pace slower than it used to be, their eyes tired but still searching for something to believe in. I realized then that bringing back the spirit of this company wouldn't come from issuing bold statements or firing off memos. It would come from showing up. And so I did. I visited every department, not as a supervisor, but as a listener. I sat in on customer support calls, watched engineers test prototypes, and shared lunch with the janitorial team in the basement break room. In maintenance, I met Michael Reyes, who had quietly developed a plan to reduce power usage across the facility by 20%, a plan that had been shelved under Cranston's regime because it didn't fit immediate ROI. Within 48 hours, I gave him a team and a budget. In the design lab, a group of junior developers had been working off the clock on an accessibility platform that would allow disabled veterans to navigate complex interfaces using just eye movement and voice cues. They had been told it was too niche to scale. I told them it was exactly the kind of innovation Arcturus was meant for. We launched the project within a week. Gradually, the changes took root. Healthcare benefits were fully restored, paid family leave was reintroduced, and the retirement fund was not only rebuilt, but backdated to include every employee who had lost their match during the restructuring. The toxic performance quotas were eliminated, and departments were given autonomy to define what success meant in human terms, not just financial ones. But numbers still mattered, and within 1 quarter, those numbers began to tell a story no one had expected. Employee retention jumped from 61% to 89%. Applications tripled. Morale surveys, which had flatlined for years, reached their highest marks since Gordon's final year. Most shockingly, revenue rose not by slashing or squeezing, but because clients and partners sensed something real, had returned to Arcturus. Integrity, it seemed, had a market value too. And it wasn't just internal. When the board reassembled under a newly ratified Structure 1 that included both veteran executives and employee representatives, I recommended the creation of a new position, Chair of Ethical Oversight, separate from the CEO role, designed to hold every future leader accountable, myself included. The board voted unanimously to implement it, and Martin Huang, the last original member loyal to Gordon's values, was appointed to the post. One afternoon, while organizing files in what had once been Cranston's private storage, I found a small box labeled David Personal. Inside was a letter from Gordon I hadn't known existed. It was short but weighted like stone. If you're reading this, David, it means the burden has fallen to you. This company was never meant to be a machine, it was meant to be a body with a soul and a heart. They will try to convince you otherwise. Don't let them. I framed the letter and placed it above my desk, not as decoration, but as a compass. And every time I felt doubt creeping back in, I read those lines again and remembered who we were building for. Months passed. The office buzz returned, not frantic, not fearful, but focused. People spoke openly, collaborated freely, and trusted again. And one morning, as I entered through the front doors, I was greeted not by silence or stares, but by nods, smiles, even a few quiet thank yous from those who remembered what the company had been and saw what it could still become. We held a small ceremony in the main atrium 1 year to the day since I had been walked out. No press, no speeches, just a simple unveiling of a new wall mural titled Innovation with Purpose. It showed 2 figures side by side. One was Gordon in his prime. The other was me, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor who chose to build instead of burn. As I looked around the room, I didn't see employees. I saw people who had refused to give up, even when everything told them they didn't matter. I saw younger staff who had found mentors again, older ones who no longer feared being replaced, and teams that had remembered what it felt like to care about the work they did and the people they did it with. Cranston's name was long gone, erased from every plaque and removed from every project. But his impact lingered not as a curse, but as a reminder of what happens when power forgets its purpose. Mine was not a story of vengeance, it was a story of reclamation, of what happens when you lose everything, not because you failed, but because others were too afraid of the truth you carried. And what happens when, despite the odds, you return not to destroy, but to heal. If you're still listening, and you've been pushed aside, overlooked, told you're too old or too broken to matter, let me tell you this: you're not finished. Your story isn't over just because someone tried to close the book. Sometimes The greatest power is simply refusing to disappear. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to hear more real-life comeback journeys that remind us, especially those of us over 50, that we still have fight, purpose, and value. You are not alone. This is the Underdog's Revenge.